forest field or mountainside. Pack up the tent and ride. What you say we get away from these city lights? Pack up your tent and ride. You know you gotta.
Hi, I'm Fraser Douglas, and I've been an avid tent camper now for almost 55 years. This is the second video in which I am describing common and popular family camping tent designs along with their primary strengths and limitations. In this second video, I'll be talking about tents that emerged on the market after 1950. First, let's talk about fabrics that are frequently used to make tents. Nylon was developed by the DuPont Company in 1941 and became the standard tent-making material in the late 1960s. These nylon tents were much lighter than canvas tents and could be easily packed in a family car with other camping gear. But nylon tents had three major limitations. They stretched when wet. They have to be repeatedly coated with a waterproof spray, and their materials quickly break down in direct sunlight. Polyester was developed about the same time as nylon, but was not used to make tents for a long time because polyester fabrics would tear much easier than nylon fabrics. But during the late 1990s and early 2000s, textile engineers enhanced the strength of polyester, and now it is the primary material used by most good quality tents. It is very lightweight and waterproof, but it will break down quickly in bright sunlight, and it holds in condensation more than either nylon or canvas tents. In the future, look for tents that are made from polycotton and polyethylene. Now let's look at some popular family camping tent designs. I'll start with the Blanchard Draw-Tite tent that was sold by the Eureka Company in the 1950s, even though it was never marketed as a family camping tent. I'll start with it because it was the first fully self-standing tent that quickly led to the development of the more popular dome tents. Initially, it was made with canvas, but soon was made from nylon mountain cloth. Dome tents emerged in the 1970s and became a very popular family camping tent design by 1990. Initially, they had a round or square footprint, low profile, and two thin, flexible fiberglass or aluminum poles that bent diagonally over the tent canopy. A few dome tents, such as this Big Agnes doghouse, have a waterproof canopy with no rainfly. This is called a single wall tent. But most of them had an inner canopy with a lot of mesh and were covered by a waterproof rainfly. Less expensive tents designed for mild weather conditions typically had a partial coverage rainfly, but more expensive tents designed for more severe weather conditions usually had a full coverage rainfly. These dome tents with a full coverage rainfly were frequently called double wall tents. This was my first dome tent. I bought it around 1990. This was a more comfortable dome tent that I bought around 1997. And this is my REI family dome tent that I bought around 2000. Between 2000 and 2010, I bought 4 small dome tents that were small enough to pack on my motorcycle camping trips. Between 2010 and 2020, this Coleman Sun Dome became a very popular dome tent, as did this Eureka Sunrise. The primary advantage of these dome tents is that they pack into an extremely small space and are very lightweight. and thus any family could easily pack one in a small car. But their steeply sloped walls greatly reduced inside space and comfort. So around 2010, tent makers began to make a second generation of dome tents with extra poles that pulled the walls out to a more vertical position. One example of a second generation dome tent is our Marmot limestone, which is very comfortable in hot weather. Another example of a second generation dome tent is the Big Agnes Big House, which has been a popular tent for several years. In the late 2010s, we began to see a third generation dome tent in which all of the poles are connected to one or more central hubs. In 1980, the Hilleberg Company of Sweden introduced the first tunnel tent called a Caron. Soon afterward, other European tent makers began making tunnel tents, and they quickly became the most popular family camping tent design in Europe. Typically, they have a long, narrow footprint with two or more thin, lightweight, flexible poles that bend perpendicular across the tent to make a hoop. And the Vango Company became one of the best-known makers. But here in the United States, tunnel tents were virtually unknown until about 2010 when REI introduced the Kingdom. We bought this first REI Kingdom about 2016. But soon after we bought it, REI introduced this tan version that was a little more stable. And today REI has this orange and red version that offers even better features. Today, in the early 2020s, more and more companies now are beginning to introduce their own version of a tunnel tent. Their primary advantages are they provide a considerable amount of interior space and comfort, and they require very little packing space. But family camping tunnel tents have a long rectangular footprint that may not fit into small campsites. And they require extra guy lines on the front and on the back as well as on the sides in order to be sure that they stand stable in the wind. Deploying these guy lines requires extra setup time, and once deployed, they pose a major tripping hazard, especially in small campsites. Many large family camping dome and tunnel tents offer large vestibules or garages, and tent makers usually suggest different ways that these vestibules and garages can be used. But I believe that most of these suggestions would be poor camping practice in most campgrounds. You definitely shouldn't cook with an open flame or store food in them. And you should not leave your shoes or bags in a vestibule or garage because it will get wet from rain splatter and because they may attract spiders, scorpions, and snakes. And finally, vestibules and garages make it difficult for tall people to enter and exit the tent. In the early 2000s, the North Face introduced its Trailhead tent as a very spacious tent that was well suited for 2 or 3 camping cots. It had a long rectangular footprint that was divided into 3 sections or pods. The central section was an umbrella tent with 4 rigid corner side poles that bent over the roof and converged at a center peak. The 2 side sections that were used for sleeping were pulled out from the central section and looked like tunnel tents. The center section of the tent was covered with a large full coverage rain fly that had 2 large vestibules. This trailhead tent quickly became a very popular family camping tent design, and several other makers began to make copies of it. Some makers copied the north face design by making that center section an umbrella tent, while other makers designed that center section as a cabin tent with a long center ridge pole and 2 vertical upright support poles. For example, this Coleman Weathermaster looks like a trailhead tent, but structurally it is a cabin tent with a center ridge pole supported by 2 vertical upright poles. These trailhead tents are very spacious and are well designed for camping cots. But they are heavier than dome and tunnel tents. They require more packing space. They can be a little difficult to set up, and their long, narrow footprint may not fit in some small campsites. In 2010, the Coleman Company introduced its first instant tent. They called it a cabin tent, but structurally it actually was an umbrella tent. Within a few years, other companies began to make similar instant tents, and Walmart's Ozark Trail brand became by far the most popular instant tent in America. They were popular for at least 2 reasons. First, they were very economical. Their price was less than half of the price of major name tents. And second, they were very easy for one person to set up. At first, there were a lot of complaints about the quality of the materials used to make the tent, but today most Ozark Trail owners seem to be fairly satisfied with their tents. So I would say if you only plan to take 1 or 2 fair weather camping trips a year, then Ozark Trail may be a good tent to consider. But if you plan to take many camping trips a year and in some cold, windy, rainy weather conditions, then you may want to buy a tent made with better quality materials. In 2020, the Gazelle Company introduced a second generation easy pitch tent. Rather than the telescopic poles used by Coleman and Ozark Trail, Gazelle uses a hubbed wall pull-out system. Most owners really seem to like this tent and say that it is made with better quality materials, is easier to set up, and is very comfortable. But it is more expensive than the Ozark Trail tents, and some owners have complained that strong winds may cave in the roof or a wall. And that concludes my overview of popular family camping tent designs. I hope that you've enjoyed these 2 videos, and I hope that you feel that you've learned something useful from them. Thanks for watching.
You know you gotta pack up your tent and ride. Pack up your tent and ride. Good grub cooking on a fire tonight. Pack up your tent and ride.
For more information about family tent camping, please visit my website, moderntentcamping.com. I want to thank my good friend Rick Adams for writing and singing this song, and his wife Katrina Adams for making sure that I had a good quality recording.
Take more trips, travel further, visit more attractions, and spend less money. Go tent camping.